Why are you so keen on this guy? Because he sticks out like a sore thumb? After meeting with Frian's grandmother this afternoon, you can't tell me that you're not curious about him at all. Maybe I am, but I also know that there are a lot of other reasons why he might have popped up here. He could be on the run from someone or something and now he thinks he's safe. Or he could be one of those wandering warrior types on some sort of weird journey to hone his skills. Or he has some legitimate reason behind becoming a slave like I said before. Following the conclusion of the day's events, a member of the arena staff led them from their booth, down into the bowels of the colossal structure. To Ludmilla's surprise, many men and women were wandering the clean, well-maintained stone corridors. They gathered around the quarters of various contestants who had battled that day. The strange slave that Ludmilla had come to see was no exception. According to Lady Frian, fans would often come down for the chance to see or speak to their favorites. In the case of the wealthy, they could pay for time together and even purchase sexual services. People were attracted to the strong, in various ways. Leanne frowned at the line ahead of them. How many women are here to see this guy? He's new and exotic, Dimir said. The way he handled his opponents and how he exited the field had a big impact too. Strong, stoic types are really popular. After all that talk, Ludmilla is the one that has us line up for a man. It is not a problem for you to be seen here, is it, Lady Frian? Clara asked. It isn't considered improper, Lady Frian answered. Most interactions here are entirely innocent. The other sort of meeting happens later in the evenings. A pair of young women came back the other way with beaming faces. Several minutes later, another group came by with similar expressions. Looks like we have a real charmer, Dimir said. That's pretty rare for arena slaves, or anyone fighting in the arena. When it came their turn, they found themselves in a tidy, albeit small, room. The man that they came to see was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor. He had changed into a white shirt with loose, brown pants. Not a trace of the carnage he had wrought could be seen. The door shut behind them as the arena official left the room. Looking up at them, the slave's dark gaze crossed over each of their faces. So, he said in a light voice, we meet again. Well, I did say that we would see what you were made of, Leanne replied. So you did, he offered them a lopsided smile. And so you have. By your look, however, it seems that your group has come for a different purpose than the others. Our friend had some questions, Clara said. How might we address you? Oakley. What does it mean? The man's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Clara gave the man a flat look. It is a name suitable for someone in my position. He met Clara's look with one of his own. I've not yet felt anything like this in the region. Are you a queen from some country nearby, perhaps? If I've heard correctly, the emperor here does not have an empress. This man is trouble. He understands far more than he lets on. Where are you from? Ludmilla asked. Your name is unfamiliar. The language that you are speaking is unknown. The school of combat you've demonstrated is not from this region. The merchant at the market told you, did he not? A land from beyond the Great Steppe. This means little to us. If it means little to you, then saying more would mean even less. Are you gonna stab him? Shush, you. Then do you have any questions for us? Florine asked. You seem to be here for some purpose. We haven't come as enemies. Perhaps an exchange of information would be acceptable. I do have questions. Oakley seemed to reluctantly part with the admission, but answers can be dangerous depending on who gives them and even when and where they are received. Before me are 5 of the most dangerous women I have seen since I last saw my homeland, so you will forgive me if I seek my answers elsewhere. Wait a minute, Dimir said, there are 6 of us here. Who isn't dangerous? You, Oakley replied. I feel insulted somehow. The man's gaze went to Dimir at her disgruntled words. Dimir sniffed and looked away. It would be better if you were not so evasive, Ludmilla said. I am curious to know how you've come to that conclusion. Because for now, she told him, you are a curiosity. You are on the way to being considered a problem. If you reach that point, you will find that all of your efforts at evasion will have been for nothing. Resorting to threats, now? Problems are to be addressed. The man fell silent, eyes gauging her from behind his unreadable expression. After several moments, he shifted in his seat, adjusting his legs and crossing his arms. I am here for a rumor, he said. One suggesting that a great calamity has once again befallen our world. Beings of great power that only appear once a century. Are you familiar with this event? You mean beings such as the 8 greed kings who appeared 5 centuries ago? Or the demon gods from 2 centuries past? With an eyebrow raised in a confused expression, the man appeared to silently mouth Ludmilla's words. Greed? Well, there were 8 and I suppose they might be considered kings, but they are not known for any specific vice or desire. Perhaps they did something that did not sit well with the locals here? I have also never heard of these demon gods, but it sounds so generic it could mean anything. The timing seems correct, however. I can at least say with certainty that the 8 greed kings are beings of the caliber I am referring to. With them comes change. I am here to investigate the nature of that change and what it may mean for the world. If that is your purpose, then why come here as a slave? The rumors are not very nice ones. Something about an undead being that destroys armies of hundreds of thousands with a single spell? I don't know how many times that story has changed between its source and the other parts of the continent, but the key details are consistent enough that it merits investigation. Discreet investigation. Making a name for oneself in the arena was far from discreet. It lent credence to the idea that he was more concerned about who might notice him on the way than who would upon his arrival. Additionally, going by the number of people that had come to see him, themselves included, his actions did provide a way to quickly gain access to information. This rumor you follow is close enough to the truth, Ludmilla said, but it only happened once. Things have been peaceful within our realm since then. Your realm, this quaint little empire? Lady Freyan bristled at his dismissive tone. Dimir frowned and adjusted her spectacles. Quaint? Such a tiny, backwards nation would not qualify as an empire elsewhere, the man shrugged. Even in my short time here, exposure to your wealthy elite at the slave market speaks volumes of what the people here believe themselves to be. It is no surprise, however, anyone would expect this out of ignorant barbarians from beyond the edge of civilized lands. I kinda liked this guy before, but now he's rubbing me the wrong way. Don't you always call this region a backwater of a backwater? Well, yeah, but I don't go out of my way to be insulting about it. Maybe he's trying to incite us into doing something? He calls us dangerous, yet he seems completely at ease. There are too many contradictions between his actions and his attitude. What will you do once you have your answers? Clara asked. Sell them to those with questions? Oakley tilted his head. I assume you do not believe that I will continue to languish in this place for no purpose. The compensation for gladiators in this arena is decidedly lackluster compared to elsewhere. I don't see why you went to all of this trouble, Liane said. You could have simply asked merchants that travel between here and the lands beyond the steppe. It isn't as if we keep foreigners out. Because merchants only see what they see, Oakley replied. That much should be common sense, even for a place such as this. As for the latter, what I said before is the answer. This is a savage land filled with primitive peoples and their primitive ways. It would be sheer madness to expect those that dwell here to conduct themselves in a civilized manner. Again, Lady Freyan and Dimir stirred at Oakley's blasé tone. It seemed that the pride of the Empire's citizens was very much a weakness that could be exploited. The way that the two women visibly struggled to contain themselves suggested that they knew they were being provoked, yet could not help but react to his barrage of insults. Are the people from beyond the Great Steppe so lacking in common courtesy? Clara frowned. Does common courtesy exist in these lands? Most of what I've witnessed is pure sophistry. He gestured towards Ludmilla with an open hand. The lady here appears to be the only one amongst you who follows the rules. The rest of you lack a certain weight. Thus, you cannot be trusted. How long will you be here for? Ludmilla asked. For as long as I need to find my answers. Ludmilla nodded slightly before turning to leave the room. On her way out, she addressed one of her shadow demons. Keep an eye on this man. Do not interfere with his activities and don't lose him. I don't know if he has any way to detect you or who is watching him, so be careful. I will contact you once we confer with Lady Schultier. The man was clearly an enemy according to her skill. Though she perceived him as such, there was nothing inherently wrong with what he had said. What sort of threat he represented was unclear. You're doing that thingy. At Liane's words, Ludmilla looked up from her brooding. The way ahead was clear, but it was not for lack of visitors. All around her, people backed away with nervous looks. They did not seem to understand what was going on as they pressed against the walls, only that something was passing through the hall and it would be wise to stay out of the way. Someone took her left hand, squeezing her fingers lightly. Ludmilla glanced over to find Clara smiling at her. "Let's not spoil the mood, shall we?" The others joined them, though Lady Freyan and Dimir continued to trail behind. Ludmilla wrestled down her feelings, yet she couldn't help but continue mulling over what they had learned from Oakley. They left the grand arena in silence. It was only after the door of their carriage shut and they were on their way that anyone saw fit to speak. "Lady Freyan," Clara said. "Dimir, how much do you know about what that man spoke of?" "I understand that the world is much larger than most lend thought to," Lady Freyan replied. "And there are many large, powerful nations, much more so than the Empire, out there." Still, the way that he put it. It was mean. Dimir scowled. People usually only see the world around them in the ways that they know, but he didn't have to mock us for knowing less than he did. The way he looked at us, it's like when some of those high nobles kids at the academy look down on everyone around them as poor and powerless. Not you, Prez. Imperial intelligence doesn't reach that far? Florine asked. "I suppose this means you're acting in an official capacity now?" Lady Freyan looked at each of them, and they nodded. "This is too big for us," Clara said. "All we can do is gather as much information as we can and deliver it to a liege. Are you going to question Oakley any further?" "I think Ludmilla was right to leave," Clara replied to Lady Freyan's question. "He was too ready. It was as if he was assured of every outcome had we decided to act." "He had some magic stuff on him," Dimir said. "Or more like inside him. Something in his mouth, maybe one of his teeth. There was an item inside his arm and in his leg and under one of his thumbnails." The way he phrased his answers was suspect, as well, Lady Freyan added. "He probably had a contingency spell on him." Ludmilla turned her attention to Lady Freyan at the mention of the unknown spell. "What does contingency do?" "It's an enchantment placed upon a target that is paired with a second spell. When the conditions defined by the spellcaster are fulfilled, the companion spell triggers." Since he was speaking so evasively, I suspect that he was trying to avoid its activation. "Do you have any idea what might have happened?" "No," Lady Freyan twisted her lip. "It's nearly impossible to tell since someone powerful and shrewd enough to cast contingency will have several placed upon their target to prevent the contingency from being foiled. For instance, if the first contingency was that he answered a specific number of the wrong questions, the companion spell might have killed him. Or he might have exploded, killing everyone around him. A second contingency would be placed to trigger if he was examined for a contingency spell, killing him or blowing him up anyway. Or teleporting him to a predetermined location. The conditions and outcomes are only limited by the imagination and the power of the caster." None of that had even occurred to Ludmilla as something that was possible. Oakley appeared well within his rights to call their little corner of the world primitive. "There's one thing I don't get," Dimir said. "Why did he treat Ludmilla differently? What did he mean about rules and weight?" "He meant what he said," Ludmilla answered their questioning looks. "The way we were raised and how we interpret the world around us is reflected in the way that we carry ourselves. I'm not sure if this is a good way to put it, but the culture of nations like Baharuth and Riastais is hollow. They are built on fallacious notions and easily crumble when put to the test. Oakley appears to understand this. He considers any leverage derived from such cultures lacking sophistry, as he put it." "How can you dismiss an entire nation's culture like that?" Freyan frowned. "He's not. Many elements of Baharuth's culture have real substance. The problem lies in perception and scale. One's behavior is framed by boundaries defined by culture and perceptions of reality. Other people from different cultures, or even people within the same greater culture, have different sets of boundaries and so you get differences in behavior. Certain boundaries do not matter to some and can be readily shattered, bypassed or ignored. If you ever wonder why demi-humans keep raiding you or some people seem deluded or inexplicably stupid right up to the end, this is why." On the other side of Clara, Florine nodded with a look of understanding. "I've worked for months with demi-human tribes," she said, "so I get what she's saying. People who are raised in complex societies become dependent on the economic and social constructs that develop out of them. Civilian nobles are a prime example of this. We exist to occupy a central position in human society. Without it, we are but a tiny fragment of what we could be. How others perceive us is dependent on what they recognize out of what surrounds us. Say we put Dimmer in front of a hungry troll. What? Little of what she can say matters. Any recourse a civilian would be accustomed to employing means nothing. Her status means nothing, her household isn't around to support her, and there are no imperial knights to protect her. No bribe or threat can dissuade the troll. Dimmer is just a noisy meal. All she can do is fight to survive because she doesn't speak the same language. Conversely, if she is somehow captured in a war between Reistais and Baharuth, her captors will be considering her fate along different lines. If she claims that she is a noble, they will probably start thinking about how much of a ransom they can get if they return her unspoiled. Beside Lady Frianne, Dimmer pouted. So he is acting like one of those high noble brats. Everyone's behavior is influenced in similar ways, Florine told her. It's just that Oki's culture seems different enough that it becomes grossly apparent. You may not be wrong about him looking down on us. To him, we're primitive barbarians. So why did he only show respect to Ludmilla? She's a noble, too. Martial nobles are something like the reverse of civilian nobles, Florine explained. When you strip away all of the status and social constructs around them, you still have a human who can beat up the troll. As long as they stand, other humans will gather around them and try to build something. Every human nation starts with some sort of martial individual who ends up leading the community and carves out a place to start building a civilization. They are humanity's version of the Lord-type individuals from races with social aspects to their nature. You're making it sound like civilian nobles are useless. Florine shook her head at Dimmer's unhappy words. We have our advantages, Florine said. The problem is that those advantages depend upon other things. Civilian nobles become more prominent when it is believed that the strength offered through other avenues has surpassed the benefit that martial nobles offer. In Reistais, this happened very quickly because it established itself in a relatively safe place. I would say that the existence of the Adventurer Guild, while economically efficient and convenient, also contributed to its weak military position. This weak position not only affected its ability to defend against other nations but also the capacity to enforce its own laws. It would have happened in the Empire as well if the Imperial Army was not founded early on. A noble from the Empire might scoff at military threats from a noble of Reistais because he knows that their retinues and levies are not strong enough to challenge the Imperial Army. As Ludmilla says, what they leverage to assert their position is perceived as lacking. Between aristocrats of both nations, however, social forms are still observed because various avenues of competition make the gap between the two nations small enough that it is better to be civil. Dimmer made a long noise as she digested Florine's words. So the reason this Ockley behaved the way he did was that he believed the Empire is so pitifully weak in every aspect that any leverage its nobles employ is irrelevant. And the reason he behaved himself when talking to Ludmilla, Leanne said, was because he could somehow sense or infer that he would have been stabbed. I wouldn't have stabbed him, Ludmilla shot Leanne a look. Or worse. He used weight to describe the net sum of every factor he could measure from Ludmilla. Civilian nobles like us are trained to convey the political influence, economic clout, martial strength and network of connections that we have at our disposal. This works great when everyone's on the same page. But, to those who don't respect or appreciate it, we look weak. Every piece of us that one doesn't recognize turns us more into a single, flimsy individual in their eyes. When a martial noble does something seriously, however, everything about it screams I am power, and everyone, human or otherwise, can feel it. Their carriage stopped at a checkpoint leading into the first-class district. After a brief inspection, they rolled forward again and turned to head towards Dimmer's home. It seems obvious in hindsight, Lady Frianne furrowed her brow, enough to wonder how I've never considered it that way. In normal situations, our martial nobles don't project themselves as Lady Zaradnik does, but it becomes glaringly apparent when they're out in the field. They are a pillar of strength to their allies and a powerful foe to their enemies. Dimmer disembarked once they stopped at the gate of Eric's manor. She waved happily at them as they continued on their way. After turning the corner, Clara looked across at Lady Frianne. I assume you'll be keeping an eye on Ockley, she said. Oh yes, Lady Frianne replied. He's not someone I'd want to lose track of. Imperial intelligence has eyes as far as the opposite side of the city-state alliance. Our awareness of things beyond that is limited to what we hear from merchant traffic crossing back and forth over the Great Steppe. From what I hear, the steppe peoples make crossing with a military force next to impossible, but, at the same time, what this man potentially represents is a cause for worry. Did it help you to decide? Clara asked. Things are growing beyond our little corner of the world. Lady Freyan looked down at the table between them. Her finger tapped it lightly against its surface. You were asking much of a duke's daughter. You were the best choice, Clara told her. It is more for the good of the Empire than it is for ours. Not only is this state of affairs untenable, but utterly wasteful. And it isn't as if we're asking for anything terrible. That may be so, Lady Freyan replied, but my cousin and many others may see it as treason regardless. Personally, I agree that working together with your group is in the Empire's best interests. From a political standpoint, however, things are more prickly, as Willem would say. Having 4 young and capable noble women who can smoothly interact with our aristocracy is the best way to turn them in support of moving forward as a member of the Sorceress Kingdom's hegemony. Lady Zaradnik's work with the Imperial Army may expedite things as well. The temples will likely not budge, of course. Nothing forceful is required. We just need a friend in the Empire. A friend, huh? Now you're playing dirty. Nobles aren't afraid of getting a bit dirty. Clara smirked, extending her hand. For the Empire? The finger on the table stopped. Lady Freyan looked out the window. After a long moment, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She turned back with a smirk of her own, taking Clara's hand. For the Empire. The cold void yawned before him. His nerves frayed and unraveled as he stood upon its precipice. You're still here, big bro? Nimble flinched and turned at the voice. You're going to be late. His younger sister, Celine, placed her hands on her hips. This is a huge chance, you can't miss out. I don't recall ever asking for any such chances, Nimble replied. I've told you and Ellen 1,000 times that I'm not. And, thus, Count Palatine Nimble Art de Lanark was ejected from his own manor and into the night. The door slammed shut behind him. Celine peered out at Nimble through a crack in the curtains of a nearby window. Just who is the Lord here? He looked towards the footmen waiting for him at the carriage. They, in turn, ignored his gaze. He was one of the 4 imperial knights who represented the will of the Baharuth Emperor, yet it seemed that his sisters outranked him in his own household. Not that he blamed the footmen. His sisters were just that imposing. Upon seeing them for the first time, many of his colleagues would gush forth with compliments and tell Nimble how envious they were of him having such cute sisters. But humans were creatures easily deceived by appearances. Both Ellen and Celine were officers in the Imperial Army, a captain of the 3rd Legion and a vice-captain of the Imperial Guard, respectively, and even members of the Royal Earth Guard would flee in terror before them. Nimble recalled the day when his elder sister was wed. More precisely, he recalled the look on the groom's face. If someone had told Nimble that his sister had run the nobleman down with her horse and tied him to her spear to bring him back home over her shoulder, he would have believed it to be the absolute truth. March. Nimble started at Celine's command. His feet carried him forward and into the carriage. The door closed, imprisoning Nimble as the vehicle carried him away. He sighed, looking down at his dress shirt and finely tailored coat, wishing that he was wearing his armor. No, not even adamantite full plate will protect me from this. He slouched into his seat, wondering how he had ended up in his dire situation. Was it because they saw him in the atrium of the Imperial Palace? Was he being punished by the gods for ignoring the thousands of letters of introduction that had crossed his desk over the years? How did Ellen even know them? Nimble had long grown accustomed to his family's incessant prodding over him being a bachelor. Every week, letters would appear introducing eligible noble women from across the Empire. Multiple copies of them. On his desk, at the dinner table, his favorite couch, the pillow on his bed. More than a few times he would sit down at the latrine and discover them attached at eye level to the back of the door. He had no idea how every single one of them came through his sisters, but at least he could politely refuse these attempts at seeing him married. Little had he known that the Sorceress Kingdom would get involved. Just how far does that damn Sorcerer King's bony hand stretch? It was surely some sort of plot. Over a year ago, The emperor had ruefully mocked himself for thinking he could tempt Einzulgaun with the beautiful young noblewomen he had plucked from their families. They were to be a gift, delivered under the assumption that the mysterious magic caster was a powerful human mage. Had these visiting noblewomen been plucked from the annexed territories of Erantal and sent to them as a sort of sarcastic reply to that time? What was their true purpose? It was highly doubtful they had simply come to see the sights and maybe find a consort. Their youthful, attractive exteriors were simply a cover for what? He couldn't even imagine. The Sorcerer King was a being who transcended mortal imagination. Whether he could or could not fathom what the Sorcerer King had planned, however, did not help his present situation. Though he was a martial noble and thus was not very adept at unraveling intricate plots or setting up civilian intelligence networks, he was well aware of the threats laid out before him. The first was that the invitation had been conveyed through his elder sister, Ellen, who had come from the Carnassus marches to visit. They were telling him that not even his family was safe from the evil clutches of a devious mastermind. The only thing that Nimble could be relieved about was that his sisters appeared to be oblivious to what was going on, instead perceiving the invitation as a rare chance to see their alarmingly still single brother married off. Lady Freyan was the second problem. The genius daughter of House Gushmond was both wary and resolute when she went to act as host for the duration of their visit. After a few days, she seemed resigned. Then, suddenly, she appeared almost carefree. It was eerily similar to what had happened to Roan Vermilion, so Nimble suspected that they had gotten to her somehow as well. Checks made on their carriage and belongings by the First Legion produced mixed results. Though its engineering was strange, the transport appeared nothing more than a well-crafted vehicle. The maids and footmen who had come along were similar to what one might find in any noble's household. Of the 4 noble women, 3 had ridiculous panoplies of magical equipment. The fourth, Zaradnik, appeared to have none. The fact that the rangers and rogues of the First Legion couldn't figure out how strong she was implied that the noble woman was using some skill or magic item to conceal her person and belongings. This on its own should have been enough to at least stop her and perform a more thorough investigation, but several things suggested that it would be better to leave well enough alone. The fact that she claimed to be a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom was enough to make anyone take 5 steps back. How she carried herself was also an immediate cause for concern. Detecting the ambush by the attainted man in the palace either meant that she possessed magic items to detect invisible targets or was a powerful individual with scout or thief abilities who could pinpoint the man's location through other sensory cues. The way she had stopped the man involved a feat that at least made her comparable to Lena's or Nimble in raw, physical ability. Furthermore, her apparent lack of concern over the whole affair indicated that she was capable of far more. Should she take affront at being singled out, how much of our winter would be destroyed? If she possessed high detection abilities, then it was also likely she had significant stealth ability. Any number of important people could be assassinated and they would have no clue what was going on. The Empire had several powerful, independent individuals, far stronger than the 4 Imperial Knights combined even at their former full strength, and it was for these sorts of reasons that they were left alone. That the Sorceress Kingdom was so much more advanced than the Empire made it likely that her equipment was far superior to anything that the region had to offer, as well. As such, they could only watch and wait and pray that nothing happened. This worked until it stopped working and Nimble suddenly found a figurative spear pointed directly at his throat. His weight shifted as the carriage turned off of Central Avenue, proceeding ever closer to its destination. Nimble frowned out the window at the citizens blithely going back and forth along the busy market streets. The situation of the Empire had drastically changed over the last year, yet the life of the people went on. As it was so often said, ignorance was bliss and he could only envy them for it. Nimble remained in his seat long after the carriage stopped and the footman opened the door. Rain pattered lightly outside and the brightly lit entrance of the Platinum Palace cast its harsh glare upon him. The unsettling sense that something dangerous was watching him finally stirred him from the vehicle and into the lobby of our winter's finest inn and dining establishment. A uniformed member of the staff walked out to greet him with a polite bow. "Welcome, Lord Anok," he said. "Your table has been prepared. This way please." He followed the man into the softly lit restaurant, past spacious booths and divided dining areas where members of our winter's high society enjoyed the finest food, discussed important affairs and conducted private negotiations. A bard performed somewhere unseen, filling the air with soft strains of elegant music. The host stopped at an open door. Nimble resisted the urge to peek carefully inside. With a quiet breath, he checked his posture before striding confidently into the room. No one else had arrived yet. He could only be thankful for the temporary reprieve. Nimble nodded at the host and, after he vanished, he made 2 rounds of the room. At first, he made a show of checking the cards at each seat, as if looking for his spot. Then he realized that no one could see him anyway and pulled out several magic items. They were issued to each great imperial knight to ensure that places the emperor frequented would be secure. Nimble activated each in turn as he carefully inspected the room. No traps. No poison in the air or on the surfaces of the furniture. The tastefully decorated panels of the walls appeared free of hazards as well. No magic items were present aside from those used for light, heating and calling for service. No magical sensors from divination spells and effects. A light knock issued from the door. Nimble froze for a heartbeat before stuffing the magic items back into his coat pockets. After glancing over himself, he turned with a smile and froze again. 5 stunning beauties stood before him. It was at this point that nearly any man would simply surrender without realizing that he had, overwhelmed by the array of feminine weaponry deployed against him. Nimble, however, was no mere man. He was one of the 4 Imperial Knights, a renowned warrior respected across the Empire and beyond. Such warriors have access to powerful martial arts. Nimble silently activated a boost art to reinforce his mental resilience. Then, he activated another that augmented his magic resistance, just in case. A tiny voice in the corner of his mind mocked him for using martial arts to defend himself against womanly wiles, but he stuffed it in a dark hole somewhere. "Good evening, Lady Frianne," he bowed in polite greeting. "Lady Corlin. Lady Wagner. Lady Gagne. Lady Zaradnik." He rose from his bow and they offered their greetings in return. After he had received them, they went to their seats and Nimble locked his gaze on Lady Frianne. "This is a co-worker, a co-worker, a co-worker. It'll be awkward if I start looking at her differently." His co-worker silently smiled back at him. Then a sense of danger entered his awareness. Nimble surreptitiously glanced around, trying to figure out who it was coming from. After a few moments, he realized they were all looking at him expectantly. Whether it was Baharuth or Eastais or any other nation in the region, human society was patriarchal. Men dominated nearly every social and professional arena, so, as the only man at the table, he was expected to lead the conversation. As the silence grew between them, so did the sense of danger. "So," he said, distributing his gaze evenly between them, "have you enjoyed your stay in our winter?" "Very much so," Countess Corlin replied. "It's been an enlightening experience overall and Lady Frianne has been a most excellent host." Nimble idly wondered what they had been enlightened about. His stomach started to churn as he thought about the possible vulnerabilities that had been exposed. The reports he had received detailed their movements but indicated little of what they had gained from them. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "Was there anything in particular that you enjoyed in the city?" "Our interests are varied," Lady Corlin said, "but I would like to spend more time in the archives and museums. There are still many performances that I'd like to attend," Lady Gagne added. "The shopping, of course." Lady Wagner smiled. "I bought a wagon full of magical appliances." His gaze settled on the remaining member of the party. She opened her mouth, then closed it again with a frown. What did it mean? What did any of it mean? Everything seemed so ordinary that there must have been something else to it. Lady Zaradnik hadn't said anything. Perhaps her activities would give something away. As his gaze lingered upon her, Lady Zaradnik's frown disappeared. Rather than smiling, however, it felt more that she was unfrowning. Nimble cleared his throat, turning his attention back to Lady Frianne. "The court council is..." The sense of danger returned, raising the hairs on his arms. Before he could look around again, the restaurant staff brought in the first course of their meal. A large silver tray on a cart was uncovered, revealing a steaming bowl of seafood soup with ingredients imported fresh from the Golden Strand. One of the servers produced a magic item and activated it. "What's that?" Lady Zaradnik asked. "It should be an item that checks for the presence of poison," Nimble answered, and the server nodded in affirmation. "That includes any spoilage." The savory aroma of the soup filled the room as fine porcelain bowls were filled and laid out before them. Nimble looked down at it with great relish. It was something Busywood had introduced to him, cuisine from the former dockworkers' home region. He had grown quite fond of the spicy, sour soup. Was it a coincidence? As far as luxury cuisine went, the common fare was nowhere on the list of things that the wealthy elite of our winter would have had served. I don't recall anything about anyone ordering the meal. Ah, the courses were selected by Lady Arnok, Lady Freyan said. She heard about the dinner and picked out your favorites for us. His mother knew about this dinner? As far as Nimble was aware, his parents were in Arnok Barony and the Carnassus marches over 200 kilometers away. His appetite dwindled as he considered that they, like his sisters, might also be unknowing hostages of the Sorcerer King. As one of the old blood of the Empire's aristocracy, familial bonds stood above all else. This was the case even with the Empire's efforts to influence traditional values to shift loyalties to the imperial throne. Nimble had a good upbringing and maintained strong ties with his family, but such bonds could also be exploited as chains. Raising the bowl to begin their meal, he steeled himself to fight on his family's behalf, silently cursing the Sorcerer King for his evil ways. Polite discussion over the restaurant's food, the nobles' accommodations and the places that they had visited went on for several courses. Nimble was more than happy to stick to these safe topics, hoping to avoid any detours onto thorny and hazardous paths. After the last of the entrees was laid upon the table, the staff left them to their meal. "So you'll be staying in the capital for another week or two?" Nimble asked. "Zaradnik will be leaving tomorrow," Lady Corlin said, "but the rest of us will be here. There are still many things in our winter that we wish to experience and investigate." Investigate what, exactly? Prying into their business was probably a bad idea, so collecting information passively as they went from place to place was the Empire's only safe option. Going over Imperial Intelligence's reports as they arrived felt like being forced to helplessly watch from afar as a stranger snuck around one's home. Speaking of which, Lady Freyan said, "Lady Zaradnik had many questions about the Imperial Army that I felt unqualified to answer. Could you perhaps lend her your expertise, Lord Arnok?" He eyed Lady Freyan for a moment, wondering what she was trying to do. "What sort of questions?" he asked. "Is there something in particular that you'd like to know about?" "We witnessed some of the changes to civilian life that the reorganization of the Imperial Army has brought about in Ingelfort," Lady Zaradnik said. "As nobles and merchants, what we observed was worrisome. For all of the Imperial bureaucracy's efficiency, it felt a bit too harsh of a change to so suddenly bring about." "It's only the initial phase of the reorganization," Nimble replied. "The alternative would be to reduce the size of each legion, but legions of that size because the Imperial Army deems it the minimum effective force required to function as an army group. Once the 2nd and 6th Legions have achieved their operational objectives, we can move forward with the next phase of the reorganization, which incorporates the civilian populations affected. And since these are military operations," Lady Zaradnik said, "the details cannot be made publicly known." "That's right," he nodded. "What you saw is also not as bad as it seems. The seasonal budget surplus created by the changes have been appropriately reallocated. It's just that the large-scale adjustments of the government take time to implement and private interests react much faster to change as they're smaller and more maneuverable." After a brief assessment of the forces being leased to them by the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the generals of the Imperial Army agreed that the 6th Legion's expansionary objectives could be handily accomplished. Once all major threats in the targeted regions were neutralized, the 6th Legion would then switch to a wide-scale operation to clean up the remnants of opposition in the area. While that happened, the civilian arms of the government would be in the process of partitioning the land, laying down infrastructure and guiding economic development. It wasn't a complicated plan by any stretch of the imagination, but it had to start somewhere. Since there was a greatly diminished need for border security in the Katza marches and along the Azalisian frontier, the Imperial administration considered it a waste to continue funding the military in those regions simply to prop up the local economy. In fact, they considered it a convenient sequence of events. Citizens affected by the changes in those areas would readily move to take advantage of the new opportunities created in the expanding frontier. There would be no need for major marketing campaigns or the creation of incentives to encourage migration. "In that case," Lady Zaradnik said, "I would like to make sure these operations proceed as smoothly as possible to ensure that this next phase happens sooner rather than later." Is there anything you can tell me about General Carbane and the 2nd Legion that might help? Nimble reached out to add more cuts of the excellent Aurochs steak to his plate. He wasn't sure what Lady Freyan had already told the Baroness, though as a civilian administrator, she probably couldn't convey any meaningful details. I'm uncertain how much you know about advancement in the Imperial Army, he said, but I would consider the commanders of the 2nd Legion the most seasoned out of the entire military, as are many of their soldiers. This distinction doesn't go to the 1st Legion? It's simply a reality of the 1st Legion's responsibilities, Nimble explained. To be certain, the strongest soldiers and some of the best commanders are promoted to the 1st Legion, but exercises and low-risk patrols in the capital region only go so far towards keeping the men sharp. It's something like the cushy, prestigious assignment that most rank-and-file troops aim for, and they become very good at policing civilians as a result. The 1st Legion does not leave our winter and its surrounding territories for any reason, so they didn't even have the benefit of our annual battle with the Kingdom of Reastais. I see. Is the reason why you consider the commanders of the 2nd Legion the most seasoned related to this? The reasons for commanders aren't exactly the same. Our commanders prefer to stick around jurisdictions that they've become accustomed to. A commander in the Imperial Army has many more considerations to keep in mind than regular soldiers. Not only do they need to develop a lay of the land, but also familiarize themselves with the social, political and economic dynamics that are unique to each legion's assignment. Transferring to the 1st Legion means figuring that out all over again, so it's understandable that they would prefer to stick to their ongoing assignments. Another reason, which is probably the main one, is that most commanders in the Imperial Army are martial nobles. And martial nobles serve for life, Lady Zaradnik said, just as they traditionally would in their territories. Exactly. Unlike our regular soldiers who look forward to retirement, martial nobles have to be carried out from their stations in a coffin. Seats for commanders in any legion tend to only open up when the person occupying it dies, and it's usually not a peaceful death. Frontier nobles never died of old age. It was an adage shared across the entire empire. Despite being generally more powerful and better trained than the average imperial knight, the risks that came with their duties inevitably caught up with them. Regular people could only shake their heads at this grim reality, or perhaps consider them suicidal, but the border lords considered it a point of pride. The foundations of the nation and its security were paid for in generations of their blood. They did not simply work for the empire, it was their empire that they fought and died for. Baroness Zaradnik appeared to digest his words with a thoughtful look. She was reportedly descended from a martial house as well, though Nimble reminded himself that he could never be sure what was really happening with anyone from the Sorceress Kingdom. The fact that she was thwarting attempts to gather information about her person lent to the impression that there was something else going on. She seemed human enough, but the Sorceress Kingdom's magic was so advanced that he wouldn't be surprised if she was a devil or some other monstrously deceptive creature conjured by the Sorcerer King and sent to worm her way into the military's good graces. What about General Carbane? Lady Zaradnik asked. I hear he's a member of the civilian nobility. He is, Nimble nodded. The fact that he still managed to become the general of the 2nd Legion speaks volumes about his ability. No one considers General Carbane an excellent captain, but he is an exceptional commander. General Carbane was a far more capable strategist than Nimble could ever be, so he decided to leave it at that. The general of the 2nd Legion could probably handle her better than he. With Lady Zaradnik's upcoming assignment as a liaison officer to the 2nd Legion, General Carbane was essentially bearing the brunt of her assault. Nimble wanted to help the general as much as he could with what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult trial, but he wasn't sure whether he should disclose anything about the man. The mysterious noblewoman might be telling the truth and use the information to make things go more smoothly. Or she could be looking for knowledge to employ against the 2nd Legion, creating problems that would serve as justification for the Sorceress Kingdom to intervene in the Empire's affairs. As the evening went on and the restaurant staff returned to clear away the remnants of their meal, Lady Calling rose from her seat. Lady Zaradnik joined her, then the others rose as well. They filed quietly out of the room. Restroom, I guess? Nimble still couldn't figure out why women went out in groups like that. Surely it wasn't for their safety. He was now fairly certain that Lady Zaradnik could destroy a good portion of the city, and Lady Freyan was strong enough on her own to wipe out entire squads of the Royal Earth Guard. Unless dragons regularly frequented the women's restrooms in the Empire, there shouldn't be a need for them to go together like that. He turned his attention away from the door. To his surprise, he found that he was not alone at the table. "Hello." Lady Gonye smiled shyly. "Shit." Focused as he was on Lady Zarodnik, the reason why Nimble had been invited out to dinner in the first place had slipped his mind. His thoughts raced as he tried to figure out how to extricate himself. It wasn't that he had anything against Lady Gonye. In fact, she was beautiful in the way that all but the luckiest could only fantasize about, but where she was from was a huge problem. Additionally, Nimble had no desire for family life or anything like that. Unfortunately, this woman could not be shrugged off or politely declined like those who had come before. What would happen if he refused her advances? What would it mean for relations between the Empire and the Sorceress Kingdom? Would a pair of Death Knights explode out of the walls to drag him away? He continued to stare silently at her as his mind worked in desperation. The young woman's smile remained. Her attractive blush grew until she rose from her seat and fled from the room with her face hidden in her hands. What imminent danger filled Nimble's senses as the threatening feeling from before returned. He gripped the arms of his chair in a panic as his eyes darted around to look for the source. Near his head, a piece of the wall slid open. Nimble jumped up with a shout of alarm. A pair of eyes glared out at him from the darkness. "Nimble," Ellen hissed, "what the hell are you doing?" That should be my question. What was his older sister doing inside the wall? Had she been there the entire time? He had wondered why she was suspiciously absent from the manor. "Wait a minute," Nimble said. "That feeling since I got here, it was you? Don't dodge the question. How could you drive her off like that?" "I didn't drive her off. Also, I've told you that there's no point in me getting married. My title isn't hereditary. The point is to have kids. A family. Your title not being hereditary is perfect since it won't cause any complications." Despite his resistance, he knew that his sister was right. Having a family and passing on one's bloodline was a concept drilled into every noble from a young age. Marriages between nobles were carefully calculated to not cause issues with rights and inheritance, but if you married one of the nobles from the Sorceress Kingdom, the children would follow a foreign, matrilineal line and thus not have any claim to imperial titles nor enjoy high-born privileges in the Empire. "So you're telling me to marry into her family?" "Obviously. Look, I get that you're hitting it off with that Zarodnik girl and she's great too, but one of the others would make for a better balance. Mother and father say so as well." Once again, Nimble wondered how many people were plotting to assassinate his single status. He hoped that the Emperor wouldn't stick his head out of a different wall, waving a flag to cheer him on. "I don't see why you're wait, are you eating in there?" "I'm hungry." She shoved a slice of aurochs steak into her mouth, chewing away with gusto. It was definitely the same food that they had been served. What was wrong with this restaurant? "Anyway," Ellen said after she washed down the mouthful with a sip of red wine, "the way I see it, we're stuck to this Sorceress Kingdom for the long term, so it's best to make some inroads. This is a golden opportunity, it'll be good for the family and it'll be good for the Empire, so don't screw up." Ellen's fist came out of the hole in the wall, making a gesture commonly used in the Imperial Army. "For the Empire." The panel slid shut. Cheek twitching, Nimble stared at the seamless spot on the wall for a good, long moment before walking out of the room. He made his way along the exterior, trying to figure out how his sister had gotten in. Hi." He turned at the sound of Countess Wagner's voice. Damn this sorcerer king. Unlike Lady Gonye, whose ample figure and demure demeanor would haunt men with fantasies of her warm embrace, Lady Wagner was slender with a friendly and energetic personality that drew people to her side. All four of the noble women were undeniably attractive in different ways, so Nimble felt like the Sorcerer King was stabbing at him with 4 different weapons. He may have been undead, but he knew exactly how to use women against men. He smiled politely at her greeting, resisting the urge to turn around and see if Ellen was watching him from one of the walls. Lady Wagner quietly twirled a loose curl of hair hanging beside her cheek. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Then, like Lady Gonye, she started to blush furiously. Damn it! With a frustrated shout, she turned around and fled into the room. A wave of murderous intent washed over Nimble, causing him to cringe where he stood. A few moments later, the rest of the women came back. Lady Freyan looked at him briefly, then glanced into the room. Lady Zaradnik frowned slightly as he straightened himself from under Ellen's oppressive aura. "Is something the matter, Lord Anok?" the Baroness asked. "It's nothing," Nimble answered. "I just came out to stretch my legs." "I see," Lady Zaradnik smiled. "Shall we return to our table? The evening is yet long and we've looked forward to your company."